warm day after all the nice weather we've had. So I'd like to introduce Daniel Craig with the Tammy Walker Cancer Center.
Thank you for the opportunity to come and present today. We're going to look at a couple of different things. First, we're going to look at the differences between combustible tobacco products like cigarettes and e-cigarettes. Then we're going to identify some potential health risks, particularly for youth and young adults for e-cigarettes. We're going to look at some of the chemicals that come off in the e-cigarette aerosol. And then we're going to look at what are some evidence-based treatments for tobacco use dependence. So the adult smoking rates in the United States right now are at 14%, which is the lowest that we've seen in a long time. And a lot of that is due to kind of a comprehensive approach to addressing tobacco. So we have programs that help prevent youth from starting tobacco. We have programs that help youth as well as adults that need to quit. We have programs and policies that reduce secondhand smoke exposure for non-smokers. And then we really identify what are the disparities around tobacco. So for instance, we know that about 30 to 44% of all cigarettes smoked are smoked by someone with either a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder. But in spite of all the progress we've made around reducing smoking rates, you can see that smoking is still by far the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. So things like heart disease, lung cancers, but really when you think about breathing in a lot of different chemicals, it can have an impact on pretty much every part of the body. So in terms of what's in cigarette smoke, there's at least 7,000 different chemicals. And so some of the chemicals naturally occur in tobacco, but a lot of the chemicals in cigarette smoke occur due to combustion. So anytime you burn something, there's going to be thousands of chemicals that are created. And that's really one of the key differences between a cigarette and an electronic cigarette. So with a cigarette, you're burning tobacco. With an electronic cigarette, you're heating a nicotine solution. So as a result, you're probably going to have fewer chemicals in an e-cigarette compared to a traditional cigarette. So in 1964, the first Surgeon General's report on smoking and health was released, and it really focused a lot on lung cancer. Then in 2014, the 50th anniversary report of the Surgeon General came out, and it highlighted a couple of new findings. One is that smoking causes colorectal and liver cancer. And then it listed kind of a whole list of other things that were caused by smoking, including type 2 diabetes. And I mention this just because 50 years after the first Surgeon General's report, we're still finding out more harmful effects from smoking. And so we're going to go through what we know about e-cigarettes right now. I think one concern is, what are we going to know in a year? What are we going to know in 5 years? What are we going to know in 10 years? What are we going to know in 20 years? Because with traditional cigarettes, the more research we get, the more harmful effects that we've found. Some of the other things we know about cigarettes from the Surgeon General are that there's no safe exposure to secondhand smoke. And Salina was actually the first city in the state of Kansas to have a smoke-free restaurant policy. And then the state of Kansas actually enacted the Kansas Indoor Clean Air Act in 2010. We know that cigarettes are designed for addiction. The design, both the contents as well as how they're designed, make them very difficult for people to stop using them. There's just kind of a comprehensive list of different types of cancers that are caused by smoking. And then this quote, I think, really gets at why it's been so difficult to address electronic cigarettes. So nicotine, while highly addictive, is delivered through products on a continuum of risk, and the combustible cigarette is where nicotine's delivery vehicle leads to incredible amounts of disease and death. And so what the research would say is if you had a person that smoked combustible cigarettes and they hadn't been able to quit using any other treatment, if they were to completely switch to using an e-cigarette, it would probably reduce their level of risk. However, on the other end, if you have youth who have never used a tobacco product that are starting to use these products, basically the population level impact could be negative. And what they found also with adults is that unfortunately a lot of adults don't completely switch to e-cigarettes. they become a dual user, meaning they smoke and they also use e-cigarettes. And what we know in terms of combustible tobacco products is it's really those first couple of cigarettes per day that are the most dangerous. So even if someone reduces the amount of cigarettes that they smoke and are using e-cigarettes, it's not going to reduce their level of risk as much. All right, so briefly want to mention smokeless tobacco. I think we tend to think of things like mouth, throat, lip, gum cancers. What we do know is there's at least 28 carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals in smokeless tobacco. Several different types of smokeless tobacco products. So you've got chewing tobacco, you've got snuff, which includes some of the newer products like snus, which is a spitless type tobacco product, and then you've got some of the dissolvables. So but I want to spend most of the time today talking about e-cigarettes. And I'm probably going to use the terms e-cigarettes, vape, and Juul. And that's because youth differentiate between these products. And so the first time I ever gave a presentation on e-cigarettes, it was a couple of years ago when they were just starting to be used. I concluded my presentation and a youth asked me, well, what about the vape products? And so for instance, if a youth uses a Juul and you ask them if they use e-cigarettes, they may say no, because it's juuling as opposed to vaping when you're using that particular product. And I think that's one thing we really have to pay attention to, particularly as healthcare professionals, is making sure that we're using the appropriate terms when talking about these different products. So vape products have 4 basic components. So you've got a cartridge, you've got a heating element, you've got a battery, and then you've got a mouthpiece to inhale. And the products can be very different. So some products are more like a pen shape, others, you may have heard of Juul, looks more like a flash drive, but here's just kind of a diagram of one particular type of an e-cigarette product. So essentially how vape products work is there's a sensor that detects when a person is trying to inhale. This triggers the battery to supply electricity to a coil, and basically the heat that's given off by that coil causes the e-cigarette juice to become vaporized, and that's what the person then inhales. In terms of what's actually in the e-cigarette juice, most e-juices are going to have nicotine, most are going to have flavorings, and then typically glycerin or propylene glycol are going to be the bases that are used in that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the role of flavorings, but I think that's one area where a lot of research is being done right now. One of the most common questions we get asked is, so what if we had a product that had 0 nicotine? Would that still be harmful? And what we know is that even though a lot of the flavorings may be pretty safe when they're in foods, we just don't know what the result is when we start heating them up and then we start breathing those chemicals into our lungs. And there seem to be a lot of concerns around certain flavors, cinnamon may be one, as well as we just don't know what happens when you start mixing and matching different flavors. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the evolution of the e-cigarette. So you can see a first generation e-cigarette looks a lot like a traditional cigarette. It was basically designed to be used and then it was disposed of. Second generation are larger. They're typically more of like a pen-shaped product. Third generation are a lot larger. Some people will call these a tank model. A lot of times you'll see a large cloud kind of coming off of them when they're being used. And then really the youth market today is in this 4th generation, and Juul has really dominated the market. You can see that they're really sleek, they're really glossy products, and in the case of Juul and some of the newer products, they also tend to have a much higher nicotine content than what previous products had. So we get asked a lot, what is in the product that comes off of e-cigarettes? And I'm going to use the term aerosol to describe that. You can see there's some cancer-causing chemicals, there's some heavy metals like nickel, tin, lead, there's some things like nicotine, fine particulates, And so what we don't know is what is going to be the long-term impact of breathing these chemicals in over time. So I think this slide right here illustrates why we get asked a lot of questions about e-cigarettes, why there's a lot of events that are being done in the community as well as across the state and the nation educating youth around e-cigarettes. And so there's two kind of bullet points. I'm going to start with the bottom one, and this is current e-cigarette use amongst high school students. So you can see in 2017, 11.7% of high school students reported using an e-cigarette. 2018, that increased to 20.8%. So that's a 78% increase in the use of these products in just 1 year. And then the number I look at a lot is, what is the current use of any tobacco product? And you can see back in 2011, that was 24.2%. And then pretty much primarily driven by the use of electronic cigarette products. In 2018, that had increased to 27.1%. Yep, and this chart here is actually going to give you a little bit more description in terms of the types of products that are using. So you can see by far e-cigarettes are the dominant product used by youth. So in 2018 it was 20.8% compared to combustible cigarettes was around 8.1%. And then you can see smaller numbers when you look at cigars, smokeless tobacco, hookah, pipe tobacco. I think the other thing that chart illustrates is we do have some dual use, meaning some youth smoke cigarettes and maybe they also chew, or maybe they smoke cigarettes and they also use electronic cigarettes as well.
Is there any actual tobacco in an e-cigarette?
So an e-cigarette just contains nicotine and typically flavorings, so it is not classified in terms of like restrictions on advertising, marketing. It's not classified the same as, say, a combustible tobacco product.
I guess I just was curious why you call it a tobacco product. It seems like more of a nicotine product than a tobacco product.
And they do derive oftentimes the nicotine from tobacco.
Just a question, is this universal? Are there any e-cigarettes without nicotine? Because I had assumed that they would have other ingredients in them, illegal and illegal. But nicotine universally is in those e-cigarettes?
So there are e-cigarettes that advertise that they have zero nicotine. One challenge is the FDA does have the ability to regulate e-cigarette products. It'll be sometime in 2020 when they actually require a listing from the manufacturers of all of the chemicals that are in the products. So there's really not someone out there fact checking if a product says that it's zero nicotine. The challenge also is that a lot of these products can be manipulated, meaning that people can alter the pods and they can add in other chemicals as well to these products.
So if it was a cannabis e-cigarette, does that have nicotine too, in addition to the cannabis?
So people potentially could add like marijuana oils into an e-juice. And we'll actually be talking a little bit towards the end. You've probably seen in the news a lot of the lung-related illnesses. We'll kind of talk about some of the findings that they're starting to have around that. So unfortunately, the news doesn't get any better for 2019. In 2019, the electronic cigarette use amongst high school students actually increased again to 27.5%. So in 2017, it was 11.7% of high school students used an e-cigarette, and in 2019, that had increased up to 27.5%. And typically, the CDC doesn't release preliminary data, but they just felt that the data was disturbing enough that they wanted to get it out as soon as they could. So compare that to adult use, and the latest data that I have is from 2017, and about 2.8% of adults in the United States currently use an e-cigarette product. And you can actually break that down. So if you look at adults age 45 and older, most of them are either current or they're former regular cigarette smokers, which means that, at least in some cases, a lot of them may be using an e-cigarette to try to either cut down on their smoking or to try to quit using cigarettes altogether. However, if you look at adults age 18 to 24, 40% had never been a regular smoker prior to that, meaning that this was the first type of tobacco product that they've used. So, flavors. there's at least 15,000 or more unique e-cigarette flavors. And flavors really play an important role just because over 80% of youth ever users report that the first tobacco product they used was a flavored product. So with combustible tobacco products like cigarettes, menthol and traditional tobacco flavor are the only flavors that are allowed. Whereas with things like smokeless tobacco and e-cigarettes, there's no restrictions on flavors. And you can see different types of products, flavors may play more of an important role. So for instance, with e-cigarettes, over 80% indicate that flavorings were one of the important reasons for them starting to use that particular product. If you look at adults, you can see that flavors tend to play a decreasing role as the person gets older. So we get asked a lot of questions. What are some of the signs that someone may be vaping? And it's definitely going to be more difficult to detect. So if someone's smoking a combustible cigarette, you're probably going to see the smoke. There's probably going to be a pretty distinct smell from that. Whereas with the e-cigarettes, a lot of times it's just a small wisp that comes off, and you may not really smell very much at all. So some of the things that you can just be aware of are, one is kind of the e-cigarette equipment, and then also scent. So we'll look more in detail at Juul, but it's the one that looks like a flash drive. You've probably also seen pictures. They have kind of hoodies now that youth can use to use an e-cigarette. They have watches with a removable face that you can vape with, and so there's just a wide range of different types of products. So the smell is generally pretty faint, but fruity flavors seem to be really popular amongst youth. So if you detect like a fruity smell, and there should be no other reason for that, that could be a potential warning sign that youth are vaping. In terms of what's being vaped, so flavored e-liquids, there's probably going to be e-liquids with nicotine, and then the data seems to be suggesting that more and more youth are also using marijuana in these products.
So that was a question I had on your statistics or data for e-cigarettes. Is that excluding marijuana or including marijuana?
Great question, and I haven't seen it actually broken down. Like
Because
that.
I've kind of been paying attention to that and I haven't really seen it either. So it may or may not be marijuana, is that right?
I think the way they add, as broad as they ask the question, I
Okay.
think the youth perception is going to be any type of e-cigarette use. And I won't go into marijuana, but we do really know that any type of drug, whether it's nicotine, whether it's marijuana, whether it's alcohol, is going to have more of an impact on a developing brain. We know our brains continue to develop until about 24 or 25, and so any potentially addictive drug is going to have more of an impact on a youth. So how many of you have heard about Juul? Yeah, Juul is really the predominant e-cigarette, particularly for the youth market. And so the original e-cigarettes, when they came on the market, had about 1 to 2% nicotine strength. Juul has about 5% nicotine strength. So essentially one Juul pod has as much nicotine as 1 pack of cigarettes. And so when you talk to youth, you'll often hear that it may range from youth may use a half a pod to they might use up to 2 pods in a day. And so essentially if you're using 2 pods, you're getting the same amount of nicotine as you would if you smoked 2 packs of cigarettes. This chart here just shows the rapid growth of Juul. So you can see in August of 2017, they had about 24% of the e-cigarette market. And then in October of 2018, they had 75% of the e-cigarette market. So in terms of just kind of some key points around youth and e-cigarettes, one, I think, is that we do know that the aerosol has some potentially harmful chemicals. What we don't know is what is going to be the impact of breathing these in over time. And again, there's just not long-term research. The other challenge is that these products have changed a lot, and it's really difficult to do research on an ever-changing product. And I just go back to my initial comment at the very beginning. When you look at combustible cigarettes, the more research is done, the more harmful effects we've been finding. And we're going to talk about some of the areas that they're doing some research in that we don't have conclusive evidence right now, but some things that they're looking into. And then when you think about a product with lots of flavors, you think about a sleek, glossy design. When you think about that there's really no restrictions on advertising and marketing compared to all of the restrictions that there are on, say, a combustible tobacco product like a cigarette, you can see why these products could be appealing and why youth could be susceptible to using them. And so one of the things you may have seen in the news quite a bit is called the Valley, and that's just the lung-related illnesses as well as deaths that have been associated with e-cigarette use. And I do have a link to the website here if they share the slides, or I'm happy I left my business card on the back. You're welcome to email me. But they do a great job every Thursday of updating that information. And so you can see that right now, 39 deaths have occurred and over 2,000 cases of lung-related illnesses have occurred. And you might have seen the press release that came out on November 8th, but they have linked vitamin E acetate as potentially at least one of the things that may be causing this. And they had collected some of the fluids off of lungs, and they had found the vitamin E acetate. They did, I think, make it known that they didn't want people to think that that was the only thing that could be causing it. But at this point, they have found at least some connection to vitamin E acetate. So some of the areas where more research is being done, and I think it'll be important to kind of pay attention to the findings as they are released. One is we know that nicotine essentially primes the brain to be more easily addicted to other drugs. And so one in particular that they're looking at with the e-cigarettes is that youth, some studies are showing youth are more likely to become addicted to marijuana if they've used an e-cigarette. And then another one that there's not quite as much research, but they are collecting information right now, is some people seem to experience seizures as a result of using electronic cigarettes. So what we know, and I've kind of tried to break the data into kind of two main talking points. One is kind of e-cigarettes in youth, and then one is e-cigarettes in adults, because we get a lot of questions from adults that want to use e-cigarettes to help them quit smoking or to help them quit the use of other tobacco products. And what we know is, in terms of adults, in 2017, 57% of Kansas reported that they at least tried to quit for one day in an effort to completely quit smoking. However, what we know is it's very, very difficult for someone to quit, especially if they don't have any support. So without counseling, without medications, without support, there's greater than a 95% relapse rate. So if you have 100 people that really want to quit at the end of 1 year, probably less than 6 will have been successful if they don't have counseling or medications. But we know what works. We've got extensive research. Really, it's two factors. One is counseling, and the second is medications. And so if you can get someone into counseling, whether that's calling a toll-free quit line, all states have quit lines. They typically start with 5 calls for most people, walk them through that quit plan. Quit lines also have a special program for pregnant women. They have a 10-call program, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the tobacco and behavioral health program. At Tammy Walker Cancer Center, we offer group cessation classes through the Midwest Cancer Alliance, and individual counseling is also effective. So you can see you more than double success rates just by adding counseling. And then if you add medication on top of counseling, you more than double those success rates again. In terms of medication coverage, if someone has insurance, unless the plan is grandfathered, most of the times they will have pretty good coverage, typically around 2 doses of medication per year. The one I'm going to focus a little bit on is CanCare, and that was under former Governor Jeff Collier. He added a budget proviso a little over a year and a half ago, and actually expanded the tobacco cessation coverage through CanCare. So it went from 1 round of treatment to now 4 rounds of treatment are covered each year. And so when you look at treatment, depending on the type of medication being at least 12 weeks, you've pretty much got year-round coverage. I mentioned the Kansas Tobacco Quit Line. 1-800-QUIT-NOW is the number. One of the newer programs I'm really excited about is the behavioral health program. So if someone has a qualifying mental illness or substance use disorder, they start them off with a 2-week starter kit of nicotine replacement therapy. They also send a letter to their doctor letting them know that they have enrolled in the program, and then they get 7 calls with the Quit Line. I think that's really critical just because we mentioned earlier that about 30 to 44% of all cigarettes smoked are smoked by someone with either a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder. And I would say Quit Lines are one of the greatest but underutilized programs. And the one thing I tell people is when they call the Quit Line, just hang in with the first call because they have to collect some basic information about you to help develop that treatment plan for you. And I know for some people, that's kind of a discouragement to continue on, but if people can stick with the Quit Line, we get really great feedback from people that go all the way through the program. So I think one of the challenges for youth that are trying to quit is that if you're under 18, medications are not FDA approved. And so the doctor could visit with a youth, and if they talk through the pros and cons, they could potentially prescribe it to a youth. However, because it's not box label recommended, it's not going to be covered by insurance, not going to be covered by Medicaid. And that's just because there's not a lot of research looking at how effective is medication for helping youth quit. Now with the e-cigarette epidemic, particularly with a lot of these e-cigarette products having very high nicotine contents, there is a lot more research that's going into this area to see if medications are effective for helping youth to be able to quit. The other challenges is the counseling programs like the Kansas Tobacco Quit Line, like the group classes that we offer, may not be the types of formats that youth are going to be most interested in. And so I think in the future, really where treatment for youth has to go is to be more interactive. We need to have more app-based programs, more text-based programs. And there are a few programs. Quit Start is a good app-based program that's available. Smokefree.gov has some links to some other kind of text-based programs that can be really good resources for youth. And then one I'm really excited about was developed by the Truth Initiative in partnership with Mayo Clinic, and it's called This Is Quitting. And so whereas a lot of other programs have been just kind of more general in nature, designed for helping people quit, all tobacco use, this is the first program that's designed specifically for youth and specifically designed around what are the challenges of quitting electronic cigarettes. So it's a great resource that we're trying to get out to the community, also getting out to the schools as well. So if you're interested in learning more about e-cigarettes, the Surgeon General's report on youth and young adults is a really great resource. They've got a lot of short videos, they've got a lot of parent tip sheets, and you can really kind of look at what is the science around, whether it's the aerosol, strategies around marketing, really kind of a comprehensive picture of e-cigarettes. How many of you have heard of Tobacco 21? All right, so this is something we're seeing a lot nationally, and it's essentially raising the legal age to purchase tobacco to 21 years of age. So it doesn't address possession or consumption of the products, it just looks at raising the legal age to purchase tobacco to 21.
Is there a legal age now?
18.
Okay.
Yep. Although you can see that 18 states either have or will have a tobacco 21 policy that's in effect. And in the state of Kansas, you can see there's actually been quite a few cities as well as some unincorporated areas that have enacted tobacco 21. And so I'll conclude by saying, I think one of the things that we have learned when we look at addressing tobacco through the years is that there's not going to be one quick solution or one strategy that's going to completely solve the epidemic of e-cigarettes. So for instance, with combustible tobacco, we've really had to look at how do we keep youth from starting. That's kind of one bucket that we have to work in. Another is how do we help adults stop using these products. Another would be how do we address kind of the disparities around the use of these products. And then another would be how do we eliminate kind of that secondhand exposure to the aerosol that comes off of the products. So what questions, comments, areas do you want me to cover in more detail do you have?
What I've noticed in several cities, I'm just traveling around, that a lot of cities are now treating e-cigarettes and vape and all this as cigarettes, and so they're banned in public places too. Has any Kansas cities taken that up? I don't think Salina has. I was one of the city commissioners that voted it in the first time here in Salina 12 years ago or so. But I'm willing to go lobby them if they need to be lobbied.
So the Kansas Indoor Clean Air Act, which is our statewide policy, does not address electronic cigarettes. And you're right, our current Salina Clean Indoor Air Ordinance also does not address. There have been some cities across Kansas. If I get your email, I can shoot you the Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights is a really good resource. They actually have a pretty comprehensive list as more and more communities are doing that. But I do think that's a trend that we're seeing across the nation is more and more cities are actually adding them into their policies. Otherwise, it becomes, I think most schools have added them into their policies. More and more work sites have added them into their policies. You're seeing a lot of restaurants adding them into their policies, particularly the more research we get around the aerosol and the chemicals that are in the aerosol that comes off of them. I think you'll see more and more communities add those into their policies.
When I talk to educators, the percentage I get from them, their guessing percentage of who among their kids is vaping is up towards 90%,
Yeah.
which is a lot different than the percentages. What is the disparity? I mean, I heard a principal last night said he would have expected all of his students in whatever income bracket or cultural bracket to have vaped.
Yeah, so I think one challenge with surveys is it is self-report data. The other challenge is there's probably a difference between regular use and has a youth tried, like an e-cigarette. And I'd have to look to see if there's data in some of our local surveys that actually get at how many youth report having tried at least one time a particular product. There's a lot of resources for schools. So Kansas Department of Health and Environment created a tobacco-free schools toolkit that really outlines how do you, one, make sure your policy covers it comprehensively and you have signage. How do you educate teachers and staff on these products because they're constantly changing? How do you get the message out to parents? How do you get the message out to your youth? And when you look at combustible tobacco products, at least 90% start before the age of 20, and about 99% start before the age of 26. And so one thing I think we need to do more with is how can we integrate curriculums so that youth is at a younger age are learning about healthy decisions. Whereas if we wait until someone's in high school, a lot of youth have already started trying these products. And so I think that's something schools are looking at is what are some of the curriculums they can implement.
Way last century, when I was in high school, I worked at a hardware store. One of the best insecticides we sold back then, which is an organic insecticide, is called Blackleaf 40. I don't know if it's still available, but Blackleaf 40 active ingredient is nicotine. And people ought to know that. If it'll kill grasshoppers and it'll kill cockroaches, it'll kill you. And that's so simple. I mean, it kept me from smoking. And everybody I could tell, because I was selling this stuff.
What your comments bring up is that it's really important if you have infants or really, really small children to keep the vials of e-juice out of their reach. Because there can be a lethal dose of nicotine in those for a really small child or infant, and they've had a very rapid increase in the number of calls to poison centers as a result of that. Just because if an infant or a youth were to drink the juice that was in an e-juice cartridge, because it's flavored, they might not realize that it's a harmful substance that they're taking in. So it is something that's really important for people to keep in mind.
So this may be fairly naive, but how, if the age limit is 18, how are so many of the middle school and high school students getting access to it?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons they're looking at Tobacco 21. So when Kansas City launched their kind of Tobacco 21 efforts in that region, one of the high school students got up and spoke, and they said that, you know, a lot of 17-year-olds have friends that are 18. And just because there's not the perception of risk with these products, if someone who's 18 gets it for a 17-year-old, they may feel that they're doing them a favor just because they don't realize how addictive, how dangerous that they are. When they do surveys amongst youth, a lot of them don't know. Juul on its website comes out and says that every Juul pod has nicotine. But a lot of youth don't realize that all of the Juul pods do have nicotine. So I think certainly from friends could be one, purchasing on the internet, it's really hard to restrict where those products are sold as well.
So you could buy it on the internet, obviously.
They have some age verification questions, things like that in place.
I'm just saying.
So I know that Juul, I think it's like 33% is owned by what used to be Philip Morris, is now a larger tobacco conglomerate. Is that pretty common with e-cigarette companies, that they are owned by large tobacco companies? So
there have been some tobacco companies like Altria that have purchased, stakes in e-cigarette companies. When Altria purchased the 30% stake in Juul, it was $12.8 billion, which is pretty remarkable for a company that started in around 2015, 2016.
Big success story. Are e-cigarettes cheaper than regular cigarettes, and also are they taxed the same?
So they're taxed differently. In terms of the cost, I would say the initial upfront cost is going to be more because you actually have to purchase the device to use. And then after that, the cost is probably going to be a little bit less in terms of, per the amount of nicotine that you're getting. However, I think it's challenging because whereas with combustible cigarettes, youth may be more aware of how much nicotine they're taking in. With the pods and some of the e-cigarette juices, it may be pretty easy to use quite a bit without realizing it.
I'm still struck by that number you said on a Juul pod, that one pod was the equivalent of nicotine of a whole pack of cigarettes.
Yeah.
And so most teens under 18 who smoke have to go to school, so they can't get in a whole pack of cigarettes between home and school. So I've rarely known a teen that smoked that much, but what would be the physical effects on a teenager with that much nicotine? I mean, I don't know how they're sitting still. It just makes me very jittery to think about that much nicotine in a kid.
Yeah, so people will build up a tolerance to nicotine, and that actually can be one sign that someone may be using nicotine, is that they're anxious, tense, kind of irritable, nervous, if they aren't using the e-cigarette, like if there's a point in time where they can't use it during class, during school, things like that. So that can be another warning sign for teachers to be aware of as well.
Are there programs to get you off it?
So we mentioned like the This Is Quitting program that was developed by Truth Initiative and Mayo Clinic. It's a really good program. There are some app-based programs that are starting to come out. I think right now that's where we're struggling at, is we don't have as many evidence-based programs to help youth as, say, what we have to help adults when they're trying to quit smoking. So I think that's an area that we need a lot more research in, is to find out what are the reasons why youth are using these products and what are the barriers, to them quitting, particularly with such a high nicotine content. And that's why they're doing research around, the nicotine replacement therapy to see if that's appropriate to use for youth or not.
How long would it take a person to smoke a pod, typically?
Good question. I will have to look into that for sure.
Okay.
Is it dosed out? I mean, can you just do it all in one sitting, or is it like like a breathing thing where you get 30 puffs or whatever. I have never seen one, so I have no idea.
Yeah, they're gonna, like on the e-juice, they're gonna list like the amount of nicotine that the manufacturer says is in the particular product, and then it's gonna be something that you're gonna use over time. So yeah, a certain number of puffs.
Are there currently programs in 305 for e-cigarette use that you know of?
We are just changing the
Okay.
policy this, tonight.
Okay.
To include e-cigarettes in the anti-smoking policies, but we don't have any get them off it. Yeah, yes, this is.
Okay.
I think one challenge with e-cigarettes is, in addition to having potential consequences with the policy, it's how do we help the youth that are addicted to nicotine? And that's where I'm really hopeful for some of these programs like This Is Quitting, and I don't think we have a lot of experience using app-based programs, but I think that's something that the schools are going to definitely need to look into, is how can we get, so maybe the first violation, it's this potential treatment to help you. And we know for most, at least from combustible tobacco, we know that most people that quit, it takes multiple quit attempts. So then maybe what's a step-up approach, another program that you could get the youth into to help them with the addiction?
I'd like to share just one brief story from the Planning Commission when I was on it. We have a vaping shop down here on East Iron, and a competing vaping shop wanted to go in across the street on the other side of East Iron. They already had a shop on South 9th. This is, 2 years ago, something like that, 2.5. And Planning Commission and the City Commission said, no, you can't do that. We're within the business district. We're not gonna impede business, but we aren't going to have exclusive rights of one kind of business in that area. The vaping shop that applied and was rejected went right ahead, opened up the shop, and only after they got a sort of cease and desist letter from the city planning commissioners did they actually back off. But the attitude was simply, hey, we're business people, we don't need to be told by you what to do. And I think there's a similar attitude that may have to be grappled with in terms of law and codes, city or state or otherwise.
I would just make one kind of final comment, and that's that, like when we find that someone's using an e-cigarette to quit smoking, the first thing that we always tell them is congratulations that you want to quit smoking, because that's one of the best things you can do for your health. I think so often we're so quick to jump and tell them all the things we know about e-cigarettes and how bad they are, and then people just kind of build up a wall. So the first thing I do when I hear someone's trying to use an e-cigarette to quit smoking is tell them congratulations on wanting to quit smoking. That's one of the best things you can do. And then just kind of explore with them, here's some of the potential concerns we have around e-cigarettes. And if you're going to use an e-cigarette to quit, one is you have to completely switch. So you can't use combustible cigarettes at all. And then two, ultimately we want you to quit using the e-cigarette products. Because one, there's the addiction, two, there's going to be the financial cost of using those products over time. What we find is the nicotine replacement therapy products are really underutilized. So some people, the patch bothers their skin, they have skin irritation. Some people think the gum tastes terrible, the lozenges are chalky, the others are only available by prescription. And then we get questions, well, why would you even want to use nicotine to stop smoking in the first place? And so I tell people it's kind of like crutches. So if you get injured, your doctor gives you crutches. You only use the crutches while you need to use them. The doctor's not intending that you're going to use those crutches for the rest of your life, but they're there for a purpose, and they help you when you really need them. And that's what, for adults, that's what these medications do. So few people use them, but so many people have coverage for them, and they're so effective at helping people manage those cravings, withdrawal symptoms. Because if you're anxious, irritable, tense, nervous, upset, you're not going to be able to focus on the behavioral component of how do I deal with stress, without smoking, or the associations. A lot of times people have smoke first thing in the morning, smoke with a cup of coffee, after a meal, things like that. And that's really, the medications help with the withdrawal symptoms so that people can focus on the other component. And then I think just kind of the takeaway message, if you're a youth, if you're pregnant, or if you've never used tobacco, then electronic cigarettes are not a product that we want to see you use. All right, with that, thank you.
What?
What?
Oh,
No more lunch and learns till January,
Okay.
and
Don't know what that
thank you for coming, and join the League of Women Voters if you're not already a member, because we do great things. So, thank you for coming, and thanks to Joan.